Hi, I'm Seamless, and this is part one in the making of the R with Silent, the track. This one is going to be the arrangement and elements of the actual track, where I identify all the little bits that created it. Part two will be sound design, part three will be mixing and mastering. So, this track, creating this track was interesting. I usually do. I started with a drop, and I started with the bass sound design, which is over here. And writing it became a little bit weird because what ended up happening was I did the first drop and I got to the break and I'm like, where do I go with it with the break? I wanted to do it again. I wanted to have another drop, but I was like, I could put some stuff from the intro in there, but like it didn't flow right. It still felt very like intro-y and like the energy was lost. Um, I honestly could not think of what I wanted to do to make the middle part actually make any sense. So I said, what the hell ever. I'll just do two drops in a row. I don't care anymore. And then this track's role in life is that it is just a giant display of just a whole bunch of sound design and arrangement of it. That's really all this track is. It's very simple stuff in that regard. And they might be thinking, oh, hey, simple stuff, but I'm not actually kidding. Just the way that I wrote this, it looks like super complicated and deliberate and all this kind of stuff, but it's really not. I'll talk about that in a second. So right off at the beginning, that's very loud. Yeah. I have this pattern make it like this kind of clocky sound. And what these are, these little samples, are things from the break speaker pack that are little tiny glitch bits. And I thought, yeah, I'll just make some sort of percussion in there. I just got like 30 of them, and laid them around in different places and different times and that kind of thing, just to add a kind of percussive spice to stuff. It's a big kind of hit in the beginning, and then here's a kick. It's the beginning. This is actually just the first beat of the actual main drum line that I cut up and put there to be the first hit. Then there's like the synth that I made, probably in Harmor. No, it's MIDI. That's right. This is actually a this is for one of the play instruments, and it's being filtered over time. I use a lot of silk in here. Well, it's the East West Quantum Leap silk, and these are the instruments that are creating like the mode stuff. Like there's this guy. I have a couple instruments going on in here. The way that I like to use East West's play engine is that I'll have one instance of it up, and I'll have multiple instruments in there, and then I'll link MIDI outs to it to actually trigger them individually, and then I'll put these out in the multiple outputs to mix them into the track. So I have one that I actually play, I have two that I actually play, one that's being filtered, and then I have one that is actually just a bunch of recorded phrases. And like that, the whole point of these instruments is just to kind of be background noise. There's not really like a theme in this track other than just bass. So having stuff around it was really all there was to it. And speaking of bass, we get our first look at the bass pretty early on. These drag samples here are actually recordings of the bass that I made over here. Every single one of them, most of them anyway. There are a couple of live basses that I used, and I may have dragged some samples from previous works out of my Slice Beats folder with a billion, drag samples that I just have in there all the time. But the majority of the sounds in here were actually created from these guys. You hear it. You can tell that it's there. And you might be thinking, well, there's not actually that much difference between what this is and what's going on in the recordings, the audio recordings, and why did I even do that? Well, this track is two things. This track was actually one of my earlier experiments doing this kind of processing at all with band passes and the notches and more band passes and that kind of like stack, that kind of thing. This is new for me. And other than that, this was the first time that I did what I referred to as channel resampling, which was kind of bad on me to actually invent a term for it because it is just straight up resampling. It's regular resampling. It's just time stretching and pitching and that kind of thing. I call it channel resampling because it's all stuff that you can do inside the channel settings window. You time stretch and you pitch and all these kinds of things to get slightly different sounds. That's something else. But the most of the rest of these guys were from, the actual thing. And then I cut them up and recorded them. And this is the other benefit of having made them the audio, was that arranging it was just a lot easier. You could still do this with the MIDI. It's just that there's some problems with stuff, like if I were to make a cut in the middle of a slide note, the slide note would not react perfectly. And sometimes the sound later kind of relies on what the sound is doing before it, and if the sound's not there before it to lead into it, it might not work out so well. So it is a lot more efficient to just work with audio in this particular business. Around this time I made this track, I was also beginning my relationship with Sonic Academy, and they had sent me over Ultimate Effects drums, and I just used a loop on top of, some drums from the Break Tweaker pack. When we get to the mixing and mastering, we'll see precisely like how some of this mixing came together to make this like a really hard hitting thing. This is one of the harder hitting tracks on the EP as a whole, and it has to do with not just how I mixed it, but also sort of the arrangement and stuff, because it's easier to make less things happen sound louder than more things happening, just because there's more room for stuff. It's pretty straightforward information there. There's just a filter on these basses here, which is causing the sort of warbly effect in there. There's more little effects in here, lots of little lead-ins. There's a lot of that going on during a drop. And this is all the silk stuff just kind of coming together all and stuff like that, just with drums and all that. And then there's a break. Lots of reverb, as you can tell, on the string elements. And then we get to the drop. So before I talk about how arranging all this works, let's actually look at what some of the individual synth elements are. Some of these are actually just straight up some things. This is actually a harmor and a citrus together, layered and played at once. I guess they're both two different things. And then tied together, that kind of thing. We'll talk about that during sound design. And then there's this one. This guy. Pretty basic sounding Reese kind of thing. But then this gets to be where it's used the most. What ends up happening is that just a regular Reese is fine. But then if I play two notes together, we get that kind of ripping and tearing ability. And that's me playing three notes together right there, and I do that later. So there's a lot of that going on. So I use this a lot. It's a neat effect to use it on that kind of thing. Now, arrangement. Well, I keep mentioning, like, using audio as an arrangement tool. And the way that I mean by this is that when I put these things down and put them into the way that I have, I really don't have a clear idea what I'm doing. And this is actually, I want to talk for a second about having an idea about what you're doing. A lot of students of mine will actually already have heard this a lot, because I use this track as an example to talk about this particular style and arrangement, that kind of thing, because one of the common questions, and this is actually something that I myself had when I was starting out as a producer, is like, how is it that people who make this kind of stuff have a sound in their head or arrangement in their head and actually make that a reality? How do they know how to make that sound? And it's kind of a two-part thing. One is, if they just do it a lot, then they'll know. Like when Virtual Riot makes a really distinctive Virtual Riot growly sound, he knows how to do that. And so when he thinks in a track, this particular growl sound I know how to do will go really well in here, he knows how to make that sound. But generally speaking, for more wild sound processing, what I mean by that is that stuff that is not necessarily planned. It's kind of random. Like when I made this stuff, the automation and the movement and the notes that I chose were all not 100% random, but it's still pretty goddamn random. Like, I kept it in key. That's basically all that I did there. And then I knew that, like, the bandpass is going to move more, the notches are going to move less, and that, like, the bandpasses need to be a bit lower and not go all the way up as much, or we'll get some pretty papery sounding things. Although I did do that for some of them, and that results in, like, stuff like this guy. So a little bit there. That's what happens when you go way too high on bandpassing. So like all those are the only parameters I had when I kind of just put down notes. If you ever watch me make these things on like a sound design request or sound design research or track from scratch, you see that I really just put down points really quickly. It's not because I know what the ska are going to sound like. It's because I know that in there, in general, parts that are going to sound pretty cool as a result of just the process procedurally creating it. Having done that, I have these masses of sounds like this with these recording. Stuff like that are like, it's like there's some reverb and then there's reversed and then it's time stretched with particular algorithms because they'll sound different with different algorithms. And it's actually really basic, but it's things that I've never done because I've always strived to do really complex stuff that I miss some of the basic things. But some of the basic things can still be really powerful, which most of you know because you do that and you end up doing really cool stuff I can't figure out. But once you do this, I put them down. I put like a part of it down, and then I use the slip tool in FL Studio. And the way that this works is that you have your clip, and normally you can change the beginning and end time of the clip, and you can move the clip around, and that's all as much control as you have. But the slip tool, you can take it and you can slide it around inside the time. And what this lets me do is pick an articulation essentially of the sound that I like. And that's essentially what I've done for a lot of these. And some of the more random ones, like this guy. Like this. There's a little less, important. This is a repetition and that kind of thing. But that's what I did for all of these. I just put them down, and like if sound went on too long or too short, that kind of thing, I would just move it, slip at it until it sounded like something flowed well. Now, as for like, how do I know when what I've done is what I want? And how do I arrive at a flow that I like? The way that this works is that it's really hard to tell when it is right, but it's really easy to tell when it's wrong. When you have a flow that just is not good. Like one particular moment that was really difficult was in the second drop, the end of the first 16 bars. So like this bit here. That's like what I'll say about that is that that's not really a good flow, but it's not a bad flow. Not so much as it is a good flow. It's a flow it doesn't offend me in any way, and it accomplishes the goal, which is to move to the next part. This is a very kind of like scientific process. It's not really so artistic, being like it causes me to feel things and that kind of deal. You can still do that, and it is probably better. But when you can't do that, you kind of rely on the science of it. And the science of it is that wasn't bad, but it was bad. Like this took me kind of a while because what would happen is that like I would have an incorrect like position of things, and like the only reason why I knew it was incorrect is because when I heard it, it did not flow. It stopped, it jerked in weird ways. The beats were in the wrong place, and it's like I said, it's hard to determine what is the right answer, but it's really easy to determine what's the wrong answer. And so what you do is as you know, we're good at picking that stuff up, so we can zero in on like precisely where it screws up, and then we just mess around with that particular area until it doesn't. And you do that for all the bits, and eventually you have something that is cohesive. And if you do that enough times, you'll also just kind of learn things that you'll know that when you do them, that you know that works and why and for when. So it's kind of like, oh, for this moment, it would actually be really cool if I did this thing that I did before this other moment, kind of thing. This is called experience. But it's also like, it's a little bit harder to do that without experience, but you can still do it just by what I just described to you. And that was how I wrote this entire thing, was just putting down stuff, doing kind of just weird stuff to it. I kind of... I don't want to say that like AU5 does really random stuff, but I did kind of take like a little bit of inspiration with AU5, where some of his songs just have so many different sounds, different articulations, and some of them are only heard once. And like the way that they make me feel is that I am for some of the sound design that I do and some of the flowing that I do, I care entirely too much about the sounding like particularly perfect. And I don't mean to say that you should just not give a shit about your sound design, because you should. But what I mean by that is that if I make something that I think is not super wonderful, for a lot of reasons, and it's usually because I've heard it way too much, because I just make the sounds a lot, so I hear the sounds way too much. But for other people, it might be like the first time they've ever heard something like that. because just there's no reason for them to have heard anything like that. Even if they are producers, they just do different things. They have not arrived at that kind of sound design. They're not used to it. So for them, it's an entirely new thing. Some of those sounds that AU5 throws around in his tracks might be sounds that he's just totally bored with. It's just kind of like but like they make rhythmic sense. They fill properly. They achieve the goal of whatever his writing machinations are. But for me, there's sounds that are just kind of like, what? How did he do that? What's going on? And while I'm not 100% sure, I'm gonna go ahead and assume that some of them are the result of just extremely free experimentation, where we're not limiting ourselves to avoid particular things. And like even really basic stuff like utilizing volume automation to do neat wobbles, or like a huge amount of some of the things I did in here were like using time stretching on things like whatever this was originally. I'm pretty sure this was actually just a percussive ding sound that I pitched down really far, and then I'll time stretch to end up making that kind of sound, and also like glitchy stuff like that, like BT style stuff. And yeah, there it is. That's the beep. That's what this is. And just kind of spicing and throwing stuff in there. Also, like every once in a while, there's the 808 hit. And like, that kind of negative space usage is super important for stuff like this, and it works out particularly well. And that's just like, that's not sound design that I planned on. Like the way that this particular thing sounded, there was nothing in my head that said I want something that sounds like that. What I did want was something that achieved a particular purpose, and the purpose of that sound was to be different enough from the previous sound, and to lead into this guy being here, and then hitting, and then that's the next part comes back in, which is then itself different enough from what it was. This is referred to as a fill. That's what the fill is. So like I wanted something that achieved that, and I just did stuff until something happened that happened to fit the bill. That's really all there is to it. I am super guilty of just like overthinking things and complicating things, and this is what happens when you don't do that. Although a lot of you learn this yourselves pretty quickly, and it's kind of interesting to watch the evolution of what newer producers are able to do for that kind of thing. Because like I was a little bit like that when I first started out producing, but like it was combined with not really a wonderful mixing experience, which meant that while the stuff that I did was musically cool, it just wasn't fun to listen to. It took me a long time to kind of arrive to this, which doesn't take a lot of people nearly as long. It's like it's something that's kind of something else. If you ever like look into like how long I've been producing raps or how long I've been producing, and I say, 11 years, don't be afraid and don't think that it'll take you 11 years to get to where I am. Part of those 11 years were spending a lot of time doing random metal shit, and also because just the technology and the computers and the software and the techniques were just not as good for just a huge swath of time that I was doing this stuff. There's a lot more information, there's a lot more capability, and there's a lot more sort of room for experimentation now than there ever has been in the history of music. So you'll have a lot much easier time acclimating to this kind of stuff than I had. Not the least of which because I'm telling you how to do it. Yeah, and then the outro was just the clocky thing from the beginning. And a big old delay was put on it to make it. And this is a bounced recording of one of the Eastern instruments just time stretched to hell to go on forever. And then it also, like, when it faded out, I kind of faded it back in with the tail there. And then the song ends at the end of it. A lot of, like, this track is a combination of trying really hard to come up with really cool sound design, but then also not giving a shit about, like, a couple conventional concepts in terms of writing a song. Mostly in the sense that there's just 2 drops in a row. The song would not have worked any other way. So yeah, that's it for this particular part of the making of The Art of Silent. Tomorrow we'll have the sound design portion, where we'll actually get to the nitty-gritty about how all these things are made. And then the third part will be about mixing and mastering, which I'll talk about mostly about drums and how they're mixed. And yeah, if you have any questions about any of this, let me know. And as usual, have a nice day.